It starts with a fatal collision. Then it gets worse. Much, much worse.
Resident Evil 2.
RE2 follows the simple idea laid out by the Alien saga, where the second installment simply multiplies the enemy count, and things start to slide out of the horror genre and into something more like action. So whereas the events of 0 and 1 were restricted to relatively confined spaces, 2 begins with the unthinkable happening, and a new, more potent strain of the virus has been released into the city, and almost overnight it seems, a massive section of the Raccoon City population has been transformed into walking corpses, and much worse things. Into this nightmare drive not one, but 2 unwitting strangers in the form of Leon Kennedy, a rookie cop on his way to start his new job, and Claire Redfield, a biker girl with a name we might all recognize at this point. The game opens with their fateful meeting, now at a gas station on the city outskirts, and marks the remake's first major departure from the original, in that, rather than being a pre-rendered animation, it's going to waste no time throwing you into the shoes of your chosen protagonist and letting you get a first-hand experience of what's going on. And my god.
What the? Don't shoot! Get down!
After escaping the gas station, the pair head into the city to find the place is in utter chaos, and what they experienced on the outskirts there is nothing but a small taste of things to come. Before they can get a handle on the situation, their car is swarmed by zombies, and our truck driver from the opening section makes his extremely dramatic return. The explosion separates the 2 protagonists, and from there they both make their respective ways through the city to the police station in hope of finding safety, answers, and maybe even Claire's boulder-smashing brother alive and well. And so begins what will no doubt be the longest night of Leon and Claire's lives, as they enter the madness of Raccoon City. As with the first game, you choose your unwitting protagonist at the start and have a somewhat different experience with each. As while you will be basically treading the same ground and unlocking all the same doors, you'll encounter characters, areas, and even entire boss battles that are unique to that protagonist. In the remake, both Leon and Claire have undergone a redesign, and while this might be a little jarring for long-term fans at the start, I am now fully sold on these reimagined versions of the characters. Taking full advantage of the immensely powerful RE Engine's graphics, Leon really does look like he's young and inexperienced. And I like the way Claire makes a show of not flirting with him during their brief meeting at the station. As I mentioned in the intro, this remake is vastly different from the RE1 remake, as it does away entirely with static camera angles and pre-rendered backgrounds, and instead goes for the more modern over-the-shoulder camera look made popular by the much more action-oriented Resident Evil 4. This allows the player to freely explore and look around the now fully 3D backgrounds, but don't for 1 second think that this is an action game, or that the new perspective is going to make it easier for you to see the enemies coming. This is survival horror, reborn and remade in a way we all thought was completely lost when the series changed lanes for the first time back with Resident Evil 4. The cramped, poorly lit corridors of the police station and the cameras positioned tightly on your shoulder means that zombies are constantly materializing at close range into your torchlight, surprising you around corners and lunging out from behind to grab you when you least expect it. And I can say without shame that on your first couple of playthroughs, these things are absolutely terrifying. Everything from their design to their animations and the noises that emit from their destroyed vocal cords as they shamble towards you with looks of absolute desperate hunger on their faces, before you line up a shot on their head, and they survive. It's not too big of a surprise, as G-Virus zombies in Resident Evil 6 could survive a few headshots, but it's still unnerving to see these things staggering towards you with clutching arms outstretched, while half their faces are missing. And as the zombies have gotten tougher, a huge quality of life improvement introduced in this game versus the original is the ability to move while aiming your weapon. No, you aren't going to be moving at full sprint, strafe shooting the legions of the dead like you're Daniel Garner. And if you want to land a critical hit, you're going to need to plant those feet and let that little targeting reticle close all the way in before firing. But you can sway in time with the zombie shamble to keep them at bay and keep their ever-lolling heads in your sights. Another quality of life improvement in the remake is the return of the defensive weapons that were introduced in the RE remake. They take the form of combat knives and various grenades and operate a little differently than before. This time, they do take up space in your inventory. However, they can be used to make regular attacks as well as fend off creatures that you let get too close to you. And the knives can even be retrieved once the zombie is put down for good. Though, don't worry about abandoning one if you're trying to get out of a tight situation. There are plenty of these things lying around. While this game in both its incarnations is more action-oriented than the first, the trademark limitations of survival horror are back. You are once again challenged by limited inventory, forcing you to make tough decisions about your loadout. Though, in the remake, you can find belt pouches that increase your overall inventory size throughout the game. This helps to balance the game's difficulty curve and the fact that you'll have more weapon choices in the late game. Likewise, lock and key puzzles are back, though somewhat streamlined in the remake. The original kept on with the tradition of style over realism, with the police station being locked up with medallions and devices that work by lighting candles in a specific sequence, or placing jewels in sockets. A lot of that has been replaced with more realistic barricades in the remake that have more real-world ways of getting past them. But there are still a few nods to the charming old elaborate locks from the original. Finding these locks and keys will require lots of backtracking through the Nightmare Police Station and stumbling into more surprises as you go. So in the first Resident Evil, the two characters' stories were like separate universes in order to push the feeling of isolation. And while this is the same for the two scenarios you can choose from at the beginning of the second game, finishing the game with one character unlocks the other character's B scenario. This was a clever little idea that Capcom had back in the original game to basically tell the other side of the first character's story. Some suspension of disbelief was required from a gameplay standpoint, as each character would effectively unlock all the same doors twice, but the puzzle pieces were moved around to add new challenges, and all of the story elements intersected with each other, and boss encounters would be different. A good example of this would be the encounter of William Birkin on the worker elevator that leads to the Umbrella Lab. Firstly, because the B game's character arrives later than the A game's character, they have to recall the lift to get access to it, and while both characters have this same boss battle, we can clearly see that Birkin is at different stages in his mutation for each encounter, and the B game character has an entirely different endgame final fight. I am personally a huge fan of the Claire A, Leon B combination for the original, and I am happy to know that this is the official canonical story for the game, regardless of what the book says. It always made sense to me that since Claire was taking care of Birkin's daughter, he would be her primary antagonist, leaving Ada and Leon to deal with the other guy. We'll get to him later though. Also, this happens.
Ada. No.
The self-destruct sequence has been activated. Repeat, the self-destruct sequence has been activated. This sequence may not be aborted. All employees proceed to the emergency car at the bottom platform.
Still gives me chills. However, in the remake, this is probably the one place where Capcom really dropped the ball. The stories for the A and B scenarios really don't match up at all, with NPCs dying twice, and boss battles being repeated for each character. There aren't really any unique areas opened up in the B games either, though there are a couple of new weapons available for each character. So rather than having two self-contained universes where each character does their part, we basically have 4 separate versions of the story. Honestly though, I think this was more of a production cost issue than anything else. Games are just a lot more expensive to make these days, and the time it would take for them to craft a more unique feeling B game probably wasn't worth investing in, leaving them to kind of do a half job, just so they can say it's there. It's not in any way deal breaking, but as someone who's been playing this game since 1998, well, you notice these things. So I've already talked a little bit about the zombies in this game, but let's take a deep dive into our collection of antagonists. As mentioned, the zombies in this game are grotesque, resilient, and fast. They are not runners, but you'll be surprised how quickly they'll cover the distance between you and them while you're trying to line up a critical headshot on them. As before, they can soak up your handgun bullets almost without notice, and are more than happy to dogpile you if you're given the opportunity. And unlike the 1998 game, and even the RE1 remake to some degree, you aren't going to be just bolting through a door and forgetting about them. Next up, we have the Lickers. The Lickers' appearance was always unnerving, as it looks like their skin has been flayed off completely and their skulls have been broken off to expose their brains. Like the Hunter, they are a fast and agile powerhouse, now with the added benefit of being able to hang from walls and ceilings. In the 1998 version, hearing their rasping breath and the click-clack of their claws was always unnerving in the early game, but the remake takes them to an entirely new level. Like with the zombies, the amount of damage they can absorb and dish out has been multiplied by factors, so you really don't want to be taking these things on without some kind of high DPS weapon, and you won't have the fully upgraded shotgun or magnum for quite a while, meaning escape is a much better option. One cool mechanic is that Lickers are completely blind, meaning that if you're quiet and slow, you can sneak around these guys undetected. But my god, does your heart beat when you have to. So we're about to enter into some minor spoiler territory here, but we can't talk about this game's enemies without talking about the big dog in the house. No, not him. I mean, yes, William Birkin is back in all his mutated glory to act as a primary boss antagonist throughout the game, and he looks spectacular and grotesque all at once. I mean, remember when this was the most awesome thing to happen in an RE game? Well, now he does stuff like this. But Billy is small fry really. No, we need to talk about the real big man in the house. You see, I knew about the B scenario from friends back when I played the 1998 original. I'd heard it was a hard mode with the puzzle pieces all moved around, but back then we couldn't just go on YouTube and have an entire game spoiled for us, and I wasn't a fan of player's guides. So imagine my surprise when this guy showed up. Now imagine my double surprise when I'm playing Leon's A scenario, and this happened. My thoughts exactly, mate. Talk about blowing your load early. And from that moment on, I was constantly listening for the thunk, thunk, thunk of Mr. X's boots throughout the police station. Because unlike the 1998 version, where he was a pre-scripted event that could be escaped by running through a door, Mr. X is going to chase you all through the police station and make life hell for you. And he's okay. You see, there's a fine line between challenging and punishing your players and just being annoying. I feel like they really landed it with Jack Baker back in RE7, though this may be because stealth mechanics were well integrated into that game, so it's a shame they couldn't get it quite right here. He is scary initially, but eventually he just becomes an inconvenience whose AI you just cheese to get around. That being said, when this finally happened, well, my eyes were narrowing, and my only disappointment was that Leon didn't hold up the fight to slowly take off his shirt, flex his scarred and blooded pecs, and give Mr. X the Bruce Lee come on before they got to it. The meta-narrative of Resident Evil generally takes a backseat to the stories of the game's characters simply trying to survive it. In both RE0 and 1, the larger story of the Umbrella Conspiracy is hinted at in notes and journals and explained by a couple of characters towards the end, who offer plot twists that surprised absolutely no one. This time, however, The fate of our main characters is much more closely tied to the larger story of the viral outbreak thanks to the introduction of several new NPCs. As with the first game, the playable characters have very little interaction with each other throughout most of the game. Leon, however, meets an FBI agent named Ada, a woman destined to become his long-term on-off love interest, and Claire makes contact with a small girl named Sherry, and the police chief Brian Irons. All of these characters have a lot more to them than meets the eye, and if you haven't played either the original game or the remake yet, then consider this your big spoiler warning. You can skip to the timestamp in the description if you'd like, but you have been warned. So, Ada isn't a fad. I mean, if that wasn't obvious by the luscious red dress and high heels. Rather, she's a mercenary whose mission it is to secure the G-Virus for an unknown buyer, who is probably Albert Wesker, who absolutely was not killed by the Tyrant or the exploding house in the first game. There has always been chemistry between Ada and Leon. Though she is clearly manipulating him at first, she does seem to fall for his sincere naivety in the end, and is genuinely grateful that he saves her life. And I mean, come on, look at this guy. How could any woman not want a piece of that? Now, in the full high resolution of the RE engine with all its wonderful texture detail and facial animations, the moments between them are more intense than ever, especially the betrayal at the end. And since we are now firmly in spoiler territory, can we please take a moment to talk about this scene?
Emma? Sweetheart, I told you to stay put.
Daddy?
Daddy's here. Okay?
My god, that got a little too real. It's in the interest of good taste that child zombies don't appear as enemies in the game, but of course they would exist. And having one thrust in front of you like that, and knowing what Daddy now needs to do is just unthinkable. I mean, think about what Marvin says to Leon at the start.
And don't make my mistake. If you see one of those things, uniform or not, you do not hesitate. You take it out, or you run. Got it?
This is a massive character upgrade for Robert Kendo, from a slightly pervy man who quickly gets eaten in the original game. And what about this letter from Jill in his shop? I wonder if that'll come back later. Claire is accompanied by Sherry Birkin, who is the daughter of William Birkin and Annette Birkin. They basically created the G-Virus. After the company tried to take his research, and I'm really not sure why he was surprised by this after what we learnt about him in Zero, Birkin took a heavy dose of his own virus and transformed himself into the nigh invincible mutant that's stalking around the police station, murdering everyone he can, and infecting them with parasites that become the G-abominations we find in the sewers. Both the characters will bump into Annette Birkin at some point, and while she makes a great antagonist for Ada in Leon's story, she really shows her true nature with how cold and dismissive she is of her daughter when she's in dire need and facing a fate worse than death. Claire also meets Chief Irons, who happens to be a perverted serial killer with his eye trained on performing taxidermy on Sherry while she's still alive. Something which leads to one of the most terrifying games of hide and seek that I've ever played. And I'm not too proud to say that I had to pause and check a guide on how to do this part because it was giving me that much anxiety. The locations are quite the mixed bag, but they provide a big variety of challenges. The upgrades they've received for this remake range from awe-inspiring to absolutely breathtaking. The police station where it all starts, and where you spend a good portion of the game, is renovated from an old museum. Playing both the original and remake, we enter an environment that feels both at once familiar and completely new. The main hall has quite a lot of resemblance to the Spencer Mansion from the first game, with its old and new feel, and strangely elaborate puzzle locks. The upgrade this place has received is truly breathtaking though, with tons of environmental storytelling elements now being added all over the station. We only have to glance around to see boarded up windows, overturned tables, and hastily erected barricades all over the place that tell the story of a war zone where the people of this city made a climactic last stand against the darkness and died. And now those same people are back, looking to take you down with them. Everything from the textures to the lighting and the sound design will set your pulse racing as you try to navigate this place, listening out for the starving moans of zombies and the rasping hiss of lickers that will have you swinging your torch in all directions to try to find them. Just like the mansion, the station has a sprawling labyrinthian feel to it, but is actually a really tight environment full of surprises. The corpses that shamble through this place and lunge at you with starved faces just keep coming, exploding through windows and doors and diving out of the shadows. And this is real survival horror. That means ammunition is in short supply, which makes your first tentative steps into the darkness a real experience. The Umbrella Lab also got a real facelift. The original was no small affair, as part of this game's story was letting us know that Umbrella is much bigger than we initially thought. The Mansion Lab is relatively small and a bit on the dingy side, but this place, I really had to stop and stare in awe for a while. I mean, if this company can afford to construct a research facility like this beneath a city with the money they made from selling penicillin, I'm wondering why they feel the need to invest in very dangerous biological weapons don't overthink it. In between these two locations, however, we have the sewers. And while I kind of get what Capcom was trying to do here, it feels a little too vanilla for me. The sewers lack the gothic charm of the station, or the sci-fi awe of the redesigned lab, and just comes off a little bland. That's not to say it's bad, and venturing through the G-Mutant gore nest is always a harrowing experience. It just feels a little generic compared to the rest. So what's my verdict? Well, if you'd asked me to name my favourite Resident Evil title last year, I'd have been torn between 2 and 4, but it is now, hands down 100%, this game. RE2 Remake justifies its existence on every level. It shows that remaking games in modern engines can provide more than just a fancy coat of paint. It can create a completely new and incredible experience built out of something we all know and love. This game goes far, far beyond what was achieved with the RE1 remake, creating something at once new and terrifying, while still managing to be familiar to series veterans. It is a true pleasure for me, to whom this story and those characters are so near and dear, to know that an entirely new generation can now experience this adventure, and that the game's original designers got to see their true vision realized. I honestly can't praise this game enough, so I'll just say this. Capcom took Resident Evil 2, one of the greatest and most important games of its era, and made it better. And so we can end our journey through the dark with Leon and Claire. Let them walk away from the nightmare into safety. But what of Raccoon City? What of the thousands of people transformed into monsters by Umbrella's terrible research? There are so many unanswered questions, so much unfinished business. One question in particular: what became of our beloved STARS members from the first game? How did they weather this storm? Well, perhaps we can answer that question by taking one more trip back into the night, into the hellish pandemic nightmare of zombies and much worse things. But hold on tight, everyone, because it's gonna be a hell of a ride. Next time, we are gonna meet our nemesis.